Mayor Steinberg has always been a champion for mental health and homelessness over the course of his 30-year career. And he came into the Assembly about 15 years ago, and then later became the president of the Senate and was the president pro tem of the Senate for about 6 years. And then when he was about to be termed out, he looked around the legislature and he really couldn't identify anyone who was claiming mental health and substance use disorder as a top tier priority. We had a lot of friends in the legislature that would support legislation that he sponsored, but no one that was really leading the charge like he was. So after he was termed out in November 2014, we like to joke that he took his requisite 20-minute break and realized he couldn't just leave the Capitol and leave that topic without doing something. So he invited a group of friends to join him in launching the Institute. And so that was about mid-November 2014. And I think the third week of November, he called me to ask me if I would help him launch the Institute. And we had our opening launch on January 5th, 2015. So, and that launch was me with a little laptop in a cafe with a wild look in my eye and just kind of trying to figure out, okay, how do we launch an institute? So that's really how it began. Yes, we do a lot of things. So the mission of the Institute is to advance sound public policy and inspire leadership on the issues of brain health. And so we do that, as you mentioned, in the Capitol through legislation and by working with Governor Newsom and his team. But we also do that by convening groups, and oftentimes they're non-traditional stakeholders. So for example, not long ago, we got together with Patrick Mulvaney after a very sad series of suicides within the restaurant community. And we joined Kaiser and Sutter and a few other groups to provide an initial kind of education to the restaurant industry. Patrick invited top chefs and restaurant owners in our community here in Sacramento, and we spent the day together talking about mental health, substance use disorder, and how to talk about these issues that we have throughout our community, but it's especially present in the restaurant community. And so that's one way. Another way that we've worked outside of the traditional stakeholder legislative arena is by bringing together the tech community with the constituents of your traditional stakeholder group. And so we work very closely with Google, with groups that 7 Cups, which is an emotional support online program that's free of service to folks who need support during difficult times. And another group called Mind Strong, which is doing some things that it's way over my pay grade, but to explain. But it's really interesting in its predictive ability to identify when folks who are living with a serious mental illness may be headed toward a psychiatric break. So we bring new and diverse communities together to inspire that leadership within their own arenas. And I could go on and on about that, but we do that a lot, and it's one of my favorite things. I love bringing that education and awareness, because we have 1 in 4 people in California living with a brain illness, and but most of us don't know how to talk about the issue, and that's all we really need to do to start a real transformation of the healthcare system. Because once we embrace mental illness, substance use disorder, and what we like to call brain illnesses, once we embrace those, as we do heart issues or diabetes or any other physical health issue, then we're going to be able to really build our advocacy in mandating that providers provide care from the feet all the way up to the head, so that we have one door we can enter and receive the care and guidance that we need when we're facing a psychiatric vulnerability, when we're really needing some assistance with a substance use disorder or a mental health issue. That's a really great question, and I have a lot of examples I could use, but I think one of the efforts that we as an institute are most proud of is referred to as a No Place Like Home program. It started as a piece of legislation that was authored by then Senate Pro Tem Kevin De Leon. It was AB 1618, and it made it so that we could access a small percentage of the Mental Health Services Act funds to leverage up to a $2 billion bond to create up to 20,000 permanent supportive housing units across California for folks who are homeless or at great risk of becoming homeless, and who also live with a serious mental illness. So that piece of legislation we sponsored in 2016. It was signed by then Governor Brown, and then there was a lawsuit that somebody, a person, launched against AB 1618, the No Place Like Home project, and so that slowed everything down. And while it was in court, we continued our advocacy on the urgency of creating spaces. We all know, there are 35,000 people across the state of California that are living in what we now call our open air asylums, right? We have 2 asylums in California now. One is a closed air. It's our jails and prisons, right? Because the asylums have been closed. For good reason, I'll say. There was much needed improvement. But now we have an open air asylum that's people living on the streets who are seriously mentally ill. And then we have our closed air asylums who are, chained to tables in jails, languishing there. And so, so we continued that advocacy. And in 2017, Governor Brown decided that it was an important enough issue that it should be put on the ballot for the November 2018 election. So that became Proposition 2. And Proposition 2 was approved by the voters overwhelmingly in November 2018. And so now we have hundreds of millions of dollars rolling out to counties who have plans in place for building these permanent supportive housing units, which are forever homes that also have access to care, wraparound care, whatever you need kind of care is what these people will receive. So we're really, really excited about that. Well, I am a minister's daughter, and my father was also a professor of philosophy, and my mother was a minister's wife that came with a lot of responsibility. And in that role, she took on refugee resettlement as her primary goal. And so forever, we always had at least a couple cars in our driveway, but none of them ever could fit in the garage because our garage was filled for, the entire time I lived there with furniture and silverware and glasses and everything a refugee might need to get started here in Sacramento. And so their passion for making a difference in our community really inspired me. And I'll never forget, actually, so my father used to used to preach at Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is just across the Capitol Park. And sometimes after church, he would take me over to K Street, and he would sit down and he would invite me to go talk to homeless people. And this is back in the late 60s, and there even then were quite a few people who were living unsheltered. And so I remember just this little girl with crooked bangs walking up to these folks, and I would ask them what they needed. And if it was in the winter, very often what they would say is they would need a coat because they're cold. And so, much to my mother's chagrin, I would give them my coat, little 7-year-old girl's coat to an adult. And the reason why it was upsetting to my mother was not because I gave someone my coat, but because, a minister's salary, and they had 7 children, so it was a family of 9, was, to buy a coat was kind of an ordeal. It took a lot for us. So that experience was, put to an end by my mother after a while. But I remember feeling so empathetic for these people living on the street. And, so that was a good part of why I got started into this world, advocacy. Yeah. Yes. Well, I started working in education because I felt that that's where we all start. Like, everybody receives an education, but not everyone receives an equal education, right? It just depends on your zip code as to what kind of education you're going to receive as a child. And I still feel that's true, and I still feel there's a lot of improvement in the public education system that needs to take place. But the more I came along in the legislature, I realized that of all issues that I've ever worked on, mental health spans all of these issues. It impacts our criminal justice system, it impacts our healthcare system, it impacts business, it impacts education and the ability to learn. And so, and I also had the great privilege of working with Mayor Steinberg. And so those two things combined really inspired me to take this issue on as my bully pulpit, to really dig in and try to figure out how we can make sure that the 1 in 4 people who live with a behavioral health issue receive the care they need so that they can flourish in their life. I do. I think it's, as a legislative staffer in the Capitol, you are working for the legislator, him or herself. And so as a result, you need to be cognizant of their constituency and also their political affiliation, because in the Capitol, until we have campaign reform and all those things, is so much about re-election, right, is going on there. And a lot of good work obviously gets done in the Capitol, but there's a lot of constraints that a legislative staffer is faced with. And so as the executive director of the Steinberg Institute, and especially because the way the Institute is put together, we are very, very independent. We don't receive federal funding. We're not a membership organization, so I don't have a large constituency that I need to answer to or satisfy. And as a result, we have this great luxury of being able to really just shine the light wherever we feel the light needs to be shown. So I feel really lucky to have this opportunity to really identify the leaders from across the nation and around the world, really, and within California also, that can help us put together a plan for the transformation of the mental health system and the substance use disorder system together in a way that's not dependent on the approval of a federal government or of 58 board, directors of our board. So I have a lot more flexibility. It's great. Well, I have to just point to stigma. And we've seen this in so many civil rights movements, right? Before, it's not until people are really educated about a topic that they can understand why changes are needed, right? We can look at that in the gay rights movement. When I started in the Capitol in 1989, I worked for a legislator who had a piece of legislation that would simply, in today's perspective, make it illegal for landlords to discriminate against gay people if they wanted to rent an apartment or a home. And that caused so much ruckus. So we then had to do a lot of education around gay rights and the need to end this discrimination. And I think it's the very same thing for folks who live with a mental illness or a substance use disorder. People, again, don't know how to talk about it. They don't know what it is. And as a result, it's scary. And people in the legislature have really been rallying around this topic now because there's enough groups like the Steinberg Institute who are doing that education and who are breaking kind of the boundaries of the stigma and discrimination that people who live with a mental illness experience on a day-to-day basis. That's a really good question. And there's several things we do, but I think the primary thing we've really been working on is to encourage all of us at every level to begin sharing our own stories. So to be out about the fact that I live with a generalized anxiety disorder, or like just a few years back, Mayor Steinberg told the story of his daughter and that of his family's struggle to ensure that she was receiving the care she needed. And so, we all know someone. If it's not ourselves, it's our child or a family member. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're not thinking that the person who is having a psychiatric break in the middle of the street is the only face of mental illness. I am the face of mental illness. Daryl Steinberg's daughter, all of us have an experience one way or another with mental illness. And so I think to break down those barriers, to make that face not so scary, to really kind of normalize it, because again, 1 in 4 of us, so it's really kind of mainstream, and it cuts across all socioeconomic lines. So I think when we are meeting with people, we do personalize a lot of what we say so that we can kind of shed a new and fresh and personal light on the issues that a lot of people want to keep kind of over there. Yes, definitely. One, just to repeat myself, is for everyone to just start talking about it at their dinner table. Talk about when you're not feeling well. Talk about when you're feeling low. Talk about when you're feeling anxious. Share openly with each other. That's going to help us cut through a lot of barriers that are currently in place. Another way, we have a very robust internship program and fellowship program. It ranges from folks who are just in the beginning of their college career, and also who are postdoctoral students and beyond. So you can go to our website at steinberginstitute.org, and there's a place that talks about opportunities to volunteer for the Steinberg Institute. And at that same location on our website, there's an explanation of how if someone would like to make a financial donation to the Institute, they can do that. So, and we do rely, it's good news and bad news that we don't accept federal, state funding, right? Because it makes it harder. And for the most part, one of the funny things I've noticed is because our founder is Mayor Steinberg, most folks probably assume that unlike other nonprofits, we're just, living large, and the truth is, as the executive director, it's a monthly chore for me to make sure that we're getting the funding in that we need so we can continue to do this independent work to transform the mental health system. We do. Primarily our work is really in the Capitol or convening state and national leaders, but there's 3 examples I can give you. So Mental Health America, California's branch, does an annual Mental Health Awareness Day that's on the grounds of the Capitol. And we set up a booth and we have lots of educational material. We talk to lots of people from the public about mental health and the Steinberg Institute. And so that's one thing we do every year. But throughout the year, we also go and speak to multiple groups. Just about a month or so ago, I gave a presentation to NAMI Yolo County. And it was a group of consumers and providers and police and sheriffs and judges. And they were all located in the Yolo County, Woodland, Davis area. And I shared a lot of my own personal story and then the work of the Steinberg Institute as well, and invited those folks to join us in our effort and gave them lots of different examples of how they could do that via writing letters of support in our legislation or applying for an internship or fellowship, and then also just talking about it amongst their friends and family. And there's another one. Well, we speak to a lot of other groups. So we'll go and give presentations between Daryl and myself and my staff. We give dozens and dozens and dozens of presentations within the community about mental health and homelessness, substance use disorder. And during those times, our hope is that they can see that there is a pathway to making a difference in this arena, because a lot of people feel like, how can I ever make a difference? But there is. And one more way we do it is that we bring in students who are learning to be psychologists, and we do conferences, not conferences, but trainings for them about how, as a psychologist or an MSW, they can be politically active and effective. And so those are really great. We work with UC Davis, UC San Francisco, and other college or universities from around the state and teach them about the political process.